Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And together, we're going to explore engaging teachers with research. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So this week I went back to a bit of a classic, and it's even more of a classic because it's a book called Questioning the Author by Beck, McCowan, Kuchen, and Hamilton. And there is a more recent version, which is kind of Questioning the Author 15 years on. And I seem to have misplaced this or left it somewhere. So I'm left with the original version that I picked up for £2 or £3 on eBay a while back, but it is still a really excellent read. It is in effect a description of how to teach reading comprehension in a way that guides pupils through a text. So it isn't read and then reflect. It isn't just asking questions after the fact. It is modeling the building of comprehension process as it's happening through what they describe as queries. Now, as with any approach to the teaching of comprehension, it isn't meant to be interpreted, I don't think, as a recipe, or if it is meant to be interpreted as a recipe, I don't think that's something you need to do in order to get real value from this book. It's a really snappy read. I gamble you can pick it up, as I did, for £2 or £3 off eBay, the original version at least. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in there. I think a lot of reading teachers in any country can learn a great deal from it. So yeah, it comes highly recommended from me at least. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
I read a really interesting blog post this week, and I immediately bookmarked it online. It's called Improving the Exit Ticket, and it's by Blake Harvard, who is the teacher from Alabama who writes really well about his practice and different ideas from cognitive science and things. And it's both a quick read, but also a thought-provoking read. And so he essentially outlines some ways in which we might consider exit tickets and their effective use in class. And so, exit tickets are something that I've seen, for instance, Matt and his teachers do really well at STEP. It's something I think I think I mentioned in the last episode about them, using those exit tickets for assessment. So it just happened that this came up on my feed this week, and we're checking out.
Yeah, this week, in a slight change to the format, I'm going to be asking questions of you, trying to tap into your experience, your expertise in the area of supporting teachers to engage with research. And it might sound like a really obvious question, but I think a good place to start is with this. Why is it important, do you think, for teachers to engage with research?
I think this episode comes with a caveat in that up until about 6 o'clock this evening, it felt as if this was going to be an unseen question episode. Yeah. But then some questions did come through. So to be honest, I don't really like prepping for things because I end up reading from lists. I remember prepping for Craig Barton's Tips for Teachers podcast, and I felt like I'd drawn back to my bullet points because I'd done a lot of prep for that interview. You want to go well and stuff. But, one of the things that when I'm reading about teachers' habits that jumps out all the time is the idea that you've got this roughly 25% of teachers who engage with reading other than pamphlets about their practice. And that staggers me because as someone who's always been interested in reading, someone who's been interested in personal and professional development, I don't understand why you wouldn't. So I think it's probably better to clarify that early, because when I approach this, I'm thinking that it's an inherently good thing that teachers engage with research because we're professionals, because our roles are extremely complex. We've managed to do over 130 episodes on teaching primary education, and we haven't really scratched the surface of the subject at all. The plan is to go for 1,000 episodes, 1,000 plus. And even then, I'm not convinced we'll get to where we really hope to. So I think that complexity suggests that it's not something we can pick up naturally. We need effective instruction from others. We need guidance about what to read. And I think it's the combination of reading from academics, teachers who are more expert than ourselves, applying that in practice, perhaps being coached. I have no one preferred model of coaching, but I do think that support from more experienced teachers is essential. And it's only really that mix that allows us to get some sort of handle on what is essentially one of the most complex jobs you could possibly hope to engage with. So I think it's an important part of that. And my hope is that by talking about our reading at the start of most episodes, we're starting to, I don't know, it's probably giving ourselves too much credit, but normalizing conversations, and we'll come to that in a bit. But I think it's important because of the expectations on teachers, the expectations of the role, and what's necessary to get really good at it. Because even after 15, 16 years, I still feel like there's more I need to learn. But that might be a psychological phenomenon as much as anything else.
There's a quotation, and I'm going to butcher it, I'm sure, so apologies. I'm not even sure I'm going to get the person right. So here it goes. I think it's from Rob Coe, which says something along the lines of, if you're not being guided by evidence, then you're being guided by prejudice. That's not the quote. Might not even be Rob Coe. So maybe this will be cut. But if it's close enough, then we'll let it go. But the sentiment is one I certainly agree with. I guess the question then is, if research is useful, as we seem to agree upon this idea, it has a part to play. It's not everything, but it has a role to play in informing what we want to achieve in the classroom. What are the limits of it? What can't it do? Are there areas perhaps where research is less useful, or are there areas where we need to kind of temper our expectations a little?
I mean, most of the arguments that we see online stem from the fact that we're operating in this field that is, on some level, an imperfect science. There's only so much we can really hope to understand. There's enough variation between students to suggest that not one approach is going to work in every situation. It's not like medicine, where we find out the root cause of something, we identify ways in which that can be treated, and then we treat until better evidence comes about. Because Ben Goldacre was part of the conversation that brought things like research ed into practice, and I think that comparison with science is a pretty powerful one, because we can never hope to know the one true way to teach. I think the narrative, certainly over the last decade or so, has shifted from best bets to good bets, and I think that's the extent of our limitations. That's the boundaries within which we work. We can say, okay, this group of studies have been replicated in a range of different scenarios. They have worked with a large number of pupils, and we can say with a reasonable amount of certainty that there's a good chance if we try this, it will be effective. What we want as teachers is we want to know for certain. I think what we want as humans is to know, okay, this is the way we teach. And that's when we become married to pedagogy. That's when we become married to strategies. And then that's when we take personal affront to the idea that this might not be the most effective way to do things. I'm pretty sure everyone who's, regular contributor to the podcast has at some point gone through that shift where they realized that the pedagogy that they were perhaps encouraged to use at the start of their career wasn't necessarily the most cost-effective way to teach. And it takes a big, big shift. I remember reading David Didau's What If Everything You Knew About Education Was Wrong? And I had to read it almost immediately afterwards again, because some of the things in there, I was like, no, this is a personal affront to me. Some of the stuff I'd been predisposed to, and I was like, okay, I can get on board with these changes. And particularly, the chapter that Richard wrote about assessment and things like that. And I was starting to maybe take a different direction there. But some of it was like, oh my goodness, this is a personal criticism. I've been doing this for so long. Why is it that why is it that this might not be the best thing? And so we need to think about our own disposition to what research suggests, the way it's delivered, and also the limitations in the fact that as a social science, the methodologies that are possible and also preferred by researchers are limited by design. And so, for instance, I always talk about research into manipulatives. Well, I think by design, samples are kept quite small and studies show the impact over a short period of time. I think I read somewhere between 68, 75 papers in preparation for that last talk I was doing about manipulatives. And so what does the research tell us? And it came up so much, those things about, people had intentionally worked with a group of 3 pupils. That only tells us so much. Really, I would prefer massive samples where, okay, this works with lots of people. I always say I'm jealous of your reading research because it seems a whole lot more clear cut than most other areas. And even then, there's still debate within the reading world about how to do things. So I think when we're thinking about the limitations of research, we're thinking about quite a few things that come together to really give us advice. And again, go back to the reasons why we should engage. That advice, then how we check how that correlates with our class, with our practice, how easy something is to implement, and then we take it from there.
Yeah, I think there are 2 really interesting themes that come out from what you say there. The first of which is being able to deal with and expect uncertainty as part of engaging with research, and recognizing that more often than not, we're dealing with words like suggests or possibly or maybe. So there's that first part. I think there's a second part where you mentioned in particular about kind of this contextual idea, which is when we say something or we think something works, the appropriate follow-up questions are, well, when and where and with whom and compared to what? And I think especially that last question, so often things that are pushed forward as this works are, when you dig into the research, often you find that what this means is this works compared to doing nothing, or this works compared to something that is demonstrably an effective practice, and it hasn't been compared to something else. I'm immediately thinking of things like reciprocal teaching, reciprocal reading, which has, in a lot of cases, hasn't been compared to other things that might allow us to work out exactly what the active ingredients behind this intervention are. I guess a third thing I'd kind of like to pick your brains about is this. You'll be familiar with the work of Gert Biester, this idea of, can't base education on evidence. What we really need is a values-based way of thinking about education. And I read that fairly recently again, and then was directed by a friend to, I think it was a document put together by Nick Rose for Teach First, called something like evidence-based education or evidence-informed education, whatever it might be, or dealing with evidence. And what I loved about it was there was this metaphor that he used, saying that we can think of research as providing us with a compass, but it doesn't tell us where to go. It's our values determine where we want to go, and the research then is a compass that kind of allows us to approach that hopefully more efficiently. I felt that when reading Biester, that idea of values versus evidence felt like a bit of a false dichotomy, and I liked the way that Nick Rose engaged with that directly. I mean, I'm sure you've read Viesta. Have you come across any of kind of Nick Rose's stuff on this, his blogs? Because I feel like it completely passed me by, and recently I've realized it's a bit of a gold mine of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I've had the opportunity to read that kind of work over the last couple of years, and my reaction was that although it started strong, the argument fell apart really quite quickly, and we ended up, and perhaps it's my interpretation, but I felt there were quite what's the name for those things? I'm not saying there were straw men in here, but those sort of the rhetorical techniques that disguise the absence of substance. I don't know what would a straw man be? What would a non sequitur be?
Logical fallacies.
That's the one. Yeah. So there were lots of logical fallacies. I don't know whether perhaps they were intentional, perhaps they weren't. I haven't read Nick's work on it, but I have read Nick's work on psychology, a book he wrote with David. And I've always found him to speak really well. I think I may have saw him at my first research ed, and certainly at some teacher development forum things as well, because I think he was involved in that for a while. And I've always found him to be really measured and thorough in his work. And so he'd be someone who I'd look to on occasion to for inspiration on matters such as these. But I haven't actually read his response to or critique of Biesta's work. But I found it. I wanted to be convinced. I like to read things that I don't agree with, but I find out. I was dissatisfied. I don't know if that's a fair reflection, because obviously on occasion, I've talked about this and I've sort of expressed my disappointment. But you were almost more positive about some of the arguments that were being made. I don't know. Is that a fair interpretation of our conversations?
Possibly. I struggle to get past, I think, what he describes as like the epistemological weakness. In effect, there's this like three arguments he lays out, and one of them says, in effect, that the nature of science means that there's always a level of uncertainty, and thus this is this great big flaw that runs through the idea of using research in education. Maybe that's a simplistic interpretation of what he's saying, but I've read it a few times and I don't think it necessarily is. And it seems like the oddest thing in the world to say in the middle of a research paper, you know what? Science can't give us absolute truth, as if that's something that is like a new thought, or that kind of invalidates, empirical methods. But still, I wouldn't say I'm that sympathetic to the argument. But that said, I do like the discussion of values within it, not least because it directed me towards those who are able to kind of engage with that argument and take us a bit further on, as I discussed before. But yeah, to anyone listening, if you're like me and for some unknown reason you're only coming to stuff on Twitter relatively recently, Nick Rose's blogs, go back to them. It's a gold mine.
I think if we go back to the original question, Chris.
Yeah, sure.
I think one thing research evidence can very quickly and conclusively show us is when there's an absence of evidence for claims being made, it's almost easier to prove or disprove something than it is to say why something works, or the likelihood that something will work, which is what makes it a whole lot more baffling as to why some of the things that were happening when I started teaching were allowed to happen, because it just took a little peek under the carpet to see the complete absence of any sort of evidence base, and that led to teachers' time being wasted, which is another reason why we should probably engage with research.
Yeah, along those lines, there's an interesting comparison of two meta-analyses relating to growth mindset that seems to have just landed on Twitter. I mean, it seems to vacillate between two positions, but generally the discourse on things like growth mindset. But it suffices to say that is definitely one of those things that I was very much bought into at the start of my career. Do think that potentially aspects of it still have value. There are things in there that I will do regardless, because unless shown definitively that this is a bad idea, it's stuff that just seems to make common sense in terms of relationship building and the setting of expectations. But it does seem to be one of these areas where there was a lot of certainty within the education profession, and now, understandably so, there isn't. And that's before we get into the much more famous, like clear-cut stuff that we can talk about with regards to, learning styles, all of that stuff that ends up being rightly hammered by people who are interested in evidence within education. So we've talked about why it's important, what perhaps potentially are the limits of research. What would you say are the current barriers that are in place that prevent the profession perhaps from being a bit more research informed? You mentioned at the start of this episode a statistic relating to the number of people who do and don't potentially read within education. So what do you think are the barriers that are preventing that kind of engagement?
I think on one level, we always start every episode talking about how time poor teachers are. Time is a massive barrier. There are plenty of teachers who would love to read more, would love to engage with research, but have to prioritize other things. And sometimes those other things are your family. I mean, I think I've certainly read less since the kids came along. I mean, I've certainly continued to read, but I remember how voraciously I used to read, when I didn't have as many home responsibilities. But then my whole attitude to how I spend my time out of school shifted at the same time, So, but I think there are lots of teachers who want to read, but they can't find the time. I mean, a lot of my advice, we come to will be about, well, how can we make the most of every moment? But I think time is a barrier. I think it's not established that this is something we should do. And I think perhaps teachers coming through now, going through the early career framework, are being encouraged to read both accessible and rigorous, robust research articles. And so that might allow them to engage more readily, because they won't have had this big gap between university and then in the classroom, spend 5 years getting the hang of the classroom, and then, well, you haven't got that habit, so you're not going to start it up again unless you get something to kickstart it. And I know we've got listeners who have kickstarted their reading again because of things like What You're Reading For and stuff. So it is possible. But I think once you're in a routine as a teacher, and you've got this perception of what the role of a teacher is and what you're there for, if that doesn't involve engaging with academic research, then it's going to be quite difficult to shift that. So I think those are probably the two big things. But I also think that and we've spoken about it lots and lots of times before, the actual, is it a grammatical barrier? The way the papers are written, you've got this wall put up by the parameters of the field, the expectations on how an academic paper should be written, that prevent teachers from engaging. I mean, I think we live in this almost golden age where we can access people's thoughts on research better than we've ever been able to before. But we should be able to pick up a paper as people who've been through university for 3, possibly 4 years, and reach this level of academic, reach this academic standard, so to speak. We should be able to expect to pick up any article and understand it, but that's not the case. So it's almost like, even if you get past the first two barriers, you can sometimes find yourself with a 32-page document going, why did I bother? And then it goes back in the drawer, or the tab gets closed, and you tried, but this is not for me, kind of thing. So I think those are the three main ones for me. It's dispositions, it's capacity, and it's the barriers inherent within the form of the field itself.
I'm particularly interested in the third of those, because I think it's fair to say that any body of research is going to rely upon a certain amount of abstruse vocabulary. It's going to say, I don't want, if I'm reading a paper on reading fluency, necessarily to have automaticity described in excessive detail. I don't necessarily need everything to be simplified back to a base level. And often it means that in order to access a lot of reading research or research more generally, you need a bit of an on-ramp. You need to get used to certain language that you're going to see, so that when you start to see it in a more complicated bit of language, you can start to pick it apart more easily. So while I think there is some need for abstruse language, I've definitely read lots of reading research where I've thought this has been badly written and this has been unnecessarily abstruse in its choice of vocabulary. And I guess there is no reason for us to assume that those that study education, study learning are going to be good writers. That might not be what happens. You know, they might not necessarily have the skills to communicate clearly and effectively. I would say the other thing that kind of got in the way for me when I first started reading research was I remember looking at methods within papers and just being completely overwhelmed. I mean, I've read a fair amount of research, and yet, brutally honest, most papers, when I get to the methods part, there'll be plenty of stuff that I still have no idea about. Just does not make any sense to me. And so what I'm really doing in a lot of cases, rather than deeply understanding exactly how a particular paper works in terms of its statistical analysis, what I'm doing over time is aggregating I'm kind of aggregating what I'm learning, and then where I find patterns, and it's going to sound like a bit of a logical fallacy in itself, where I see people who I respect and who I know a great deal about this field also saying, well, yeah, this makes sense, this aligns with what we've seen before, I start to pay it a bit more attention. In the end, we have to, it goes back to that point of not of dealing with uncertainty, but in a slightly different way. I think we have to deal with being a bit confused and being a bit lost for a while at least, and leaning into that with research. But yeah, the way it's written is often one of the key barriers. In terms of, you say, disposition, I found for a while, when I first started reading research and getting into podcasts and other bits and pieces that I found interesting, that those who had been in the profession for a considerable period of time and who hadn't engaged with that stuff occasionally seemed to be a bit defensive when this stuff was discussed, which kind of makes sense. If you're trying to say that this might be an important idea and they've been teaching for 30 years and they've not engaged with it at all, that's going to hit at their sense of, self-esteem. But would you say at all that there is reluctance to read within the profession sometimes, and particularly perhaps within the primary profession, because there are lots of people who got into teaching not with that, in that frame of mind? They're not thinking of it as, this is a job that will exercise me intellectually in that way. It will exercise me intellectually in a load of different ways, but not in that particular way that I left behind at university. Do you sense that at all within the profession, or am I way off base?
I think you're onto something. I mean, I recognize what you're describing. I'm not sure I could comment as to the frequency with which you might encounter that disposition or that approach or attitude. But I know that people get into teaching for many different reasons. Predominantly to work with children, to help children. And then when you look then at perhaps the ideological leanings of teachers, then that might change. Certainly, particularly in primary, and the child first, experiential based sort of ideology is probably the prevailing ideology, I would imagine. It certainly feels like when we discuss the things we discuss, we are far from in the majority, and almost adopting this minority position that we're trying to espouse to other people, if that makes sense. So this is a long and clunky way of saying I think you're correct, Chris. I think it comes down to how we view the purpose and the motivation behind becoming a teacher. Because it might be that there are many, many other facets of our role that people find more important. And it's not for me to say whether they're right or wrong, just that I wouldn't necessarily agree.
Yeah, I think that's a particularly nuanced and fair way to describe it. Talked about the barriers. I guess that directly leads us to another question, which is, well, what do you think that school leaders can do to support their teachers in engaging with research?
The first thing they have to do is acknowledge that this is something that's worthwhile doing, because you're going to need to dedicate reasonably significant resources if you want it to become prevalent across your school. And I think, this leads directly to how we encourage pupil behavior in the classroom. We think about what Pep says about things like social norms. Essentially, if you're a school leader and you want your teachers to engage with research, you need to make it the social norm, and you need to, at the very least, get the critical mass into a position where they view this as something of value. So the head teacher themselves need to value it, and then that needs to trickle down to teachers. Now, if time is a barrier, then you need, as head teacher, school leader, you need to make a reasonable amount of time available, perhaps guided, perhaps unguided, perhaps a combination of both, where people can meaningfully engage with the research. So, for instance, I'm talking about how I used to read when the 20 minutes when my computer was loading up, and everyone laughs because computers take a long time to load up in schools. But when school leaders take this seriously, you provide opportunities. Now, it might be that the first 15 minutes of a staff meeting, and there are arguments as to whether or not this is good use of staff meeting time, but those first 15 minutes are there to perhaps read a shared paper, perhaps to do some independent reading, or maybe you've got a project you're looking at over the course of a year. But you might choose, 15 minutes a week. That's still going to be a couple of hours more than if that time isn't available. It might be that your workload expectations are such that reading research is more than possible within the working day. I'm a big advocate for using school time for improving your knowledge of school matters. I enjoy reading this kind of thing. I'll read it at nighttime. I'll read it when I wake up in the morning. But when I have the opportunity, I will be reading in school. And so I think, considering, when works for us, what pressures can we remove from our teachers? Because then they've got the opportunity. In terms of social norms, I think the provision of, would it just come down to the provision? If I think about my own experience, went into a school in 2017, the only constant was change. Teachers weren't necessarily engaged with their practice because they had so many other things on their plate. Now, the school leaders addressed that, but they also asked me to encourage people, to make it the norm that teachers engage with research. And so I would do things like, I would choose a paper every week and I would leave it in the staff room, multiple copies. So that here's something I think is worth reading. Not everybody did, but one or two people would. I would encourage conversations in the staff room. I would have books about education in the staff room. People would sign in and out. Lots of people do those libraries. But as a school leader, I would also ask teachers about their reading experience. Oh, what did you think of that chapter? I'm pretty sure I've spoken about Jack Harker before, coming back to me with things he read in How I Wish I Taught Maths that disagreed with what I was saying to him. And then he was challenging me. And that's brilliant because he has challenged me based on his reading, you know. And so once we've given the time, once we've given the opportunity, I think that we then need to give the material, and we need to make engaging with that material normal. So if that's things like being caught reading, if it's things like conversations about the essence of a paper, about the themes, how a paper relates to school, and then encouraging that within the sort of staff run CPD, you then start to tie everything together. Because if people see that kind of reading research directly linked with their roles, then they get to a point where actually this might be beneficial both for my career, but also for my pupils. And I remember the Senko at that school used to say, love your CPD, so much theory at the start. And I would always start with the why. And here's, because I wanted people to challenge my thinking. So if here's my basis for this CPD, I'm open to have my mind changed, but this is where we're going from. And I think that kind of approach where we outline our sources encourages other people to do the same too. And I think they're in the position now where that's the norm, but it starts with one or two people. And then when other people see the conversations, or hear the conversations in the staff room, they then think, well, maybe I'll get involved in this. And then obviously, as you bring new teachers in and they see so many other people engaging, well, then you get to that point where you've got critical mass, and you get to the point where this is just something we do here, which is, perhaps talks about with behavior in class. You want to be seen that, it is good, inherently good to do homework. This is something this class does. I hope I'm not misquoting him. But that's one of the things that stood out whenever I spoke to him on the podcast. And thinking about, well, what is it we can do to get to that point? Now, I've given some pretty specific examples, but I think any of the research, any of the guidance on how we can influence social norms probably applies, and we can take those and we can place them into this situation.
I particularly like what you said there about your professional development starting with a discussion of the research, but also theory. I particularly picked up on that word, because one thing I almost want to say to school leaders that they really shouldn't do, I think, if they want to engage people, get people more engaged with research, is something I've seen done by others. You haven't done it here at all. You've done quite the opposite. But something I've seen done by others, which is to say, we do this because research says it works, or research says this. They use it, research as a trump card in arguments to kind of like shut down discussion, which is kind of the opposite of what you're doing. You're using it as a way to outline your theory behind why something might work. I mean, I'm someone who spends a little bit of my career going around to schools and other places talking about the evidence base related to different aspects of reading. And yet, if someone then says to me, okay, but why should we do this? Or why do you think this is a good idea? I'm not then talking about, effect sizes. I'm talking about mechanisms, talking about the theory behind why something might work. It's that changes minds. And yes, that is often buttressed by a body of empirical research that is where that theory comes from. But it's the theory about why this stuff works that matters. I'd say one other thing that I think school leaders, again, this is more what they shouldn't do, is making stuff a fad. So if you are going to do something related to a bit of research, if you're going to implement something, I think if you then don't follow up on it and it just becomes something that school did for a few months and then forgot about, I think that's a way to understandably build cynicism within the profession about research. And I think there is a lot of, again, understandable cynicism related to research, because I've lost track of the number of secondary teachers I've spoken to who will say things like, oh yeah, we were introduced to, I don't know, Rosenshine's principles of instruction. That was the thing we did for 3 months or for 6 months. And then we moved on. And at the time that was described as, this is research. It's a good idea because research. So another thing not to do, try and avoid fads, try to avoid using just the idea of research as some kind of trump card in arguments about pedagogy. In the end, you are coming back to a discussion of theory, of your ideas about how learning works in a specific situation.
Yeah, I mean, the research says is generally a red flag in arguments of pedagogy and arguments about research and things, and that's when there's a high likelihood this person hasn't necessarily engaged with the research in the certainly whenever you're having this conversation with someone, Chris, in the same level of depth that you will have gone to make sure you've read, even all the appendices and things out there. I mean, you were on Brendan Lee's podcast recently. When Brendan and I spoke, he spent a lot of time discussing how teacher development is about behavior change and habit formation. And obviously, if something's a fad, well, then you haven't got to the point where you have instigated behavioral change. You haven't made a part of what it is to be a teacher in your school. And so I think, all that sort of rich, the sort of the canon on how we can improve our teachers that's certainly come to the fore in recent years supports that idea of avoiding fad making and actually what is it we can do to make our changes to our practice meaningful and robust. I always talk about how essentially you want to make yourself redundant because the teachers are so self-sufficient and so effective that you're no longer necessary, and that's in that school improvement or teacher improvement situation. So I think very important point and sort of aligned with how many schools are developing their working practices and seeing things as a 5-year, 10-year journey, as opposed to, like you say, 6 months. Let's do Rose and Shine for 6 months. That's not going to work.
So we've talked about the role of school leaders in promoting engagement with research. Let's assume that a listener might be a teacher who is in a school where this isn't there, that support perhaps isn't there at the moment. What advice would you give to an individual teacher in that situation who was keen to begin engaging with research? Perhaps someone who was enthused but didn't know where to begin. Any advice, any tips?
Well, obviously listen to this podcast. I think it's a good gateway drug.
Naturally, of course.
Research. Because lots of the fantastic guests we've had over the years have used quite seminal papers to begin their responses to the various questions that I've asked them. So it doesn't just have to be this podcast. There are lots of other podcasts with us in a similar vein. Obviously, you've got the Mr. Barton Maths podcast and tips for teachers. Craig's output encouraged me to engage more meaningfully, and he also suggested the types of things that I might be better reading rather than reading about hats and things like that there. And so, listen to that, listen to the ERRR, and I'm sure there are lots. Brendan, I think Brendan's all about development of teacher knowledge and things. I'll feel bad because I haven't made a massive list. So maybe that's one for the website where I put up podcasts that have inspired me, because I listen to hundreds of podcasts a month, maybe 3 or 4 days sometimes. Always trying to find out more, but also because I can typically work while I'm listening to podcasts, particularly on tasks that don't require my full attention. And, when I have to commute, I'll typically have 2 or 3 downloaded, or a long one, and I enjoy long form podcasts. And I think that's a really good way to get into things. Like I said, we're, this golden age of accessibility. So look for people who have gone to great lengths to explain research to teachers. You mentioned Professor Coe, who, over, certainly the last 10, 15, 20 years has gone to great lengths to try and make the dense and seemingly impenetrable pretty accessible and clear for teachers. Obviously, the stuff he wrote and spoke about with regards to lesson observations, that's taking quite a complex field and making it pretty clear. Here are your best bets. Here are your good bets for this. So trying to identify those people. Tom Sharrington for a long time has done the same thing with his writing. And mentioned David Dye. Peps' evidence snacks. They're fantastic because Peps breaks down ideas on a Thursday morning. Don't know if he's stopping for the summer, but there was certainly one this morning in my inbox. And anyone who's out there trying to distill research for us, hunt them out, and sort of, and then look at who they're listening to or who they're reading, who they're following, engaging with on Twitter, and then bit by bit developing that network of people that you feel you can trust, because we can never fully trust online persona 100%, but you could almost put some of your eggs in a few different baskets, and at the very least you'll have started to engage with the subject matter in a little bit more depth, even if it turns out that you might go up a few garden paths before finding, I don't know. I don't know what you'd find before finding sort of the, finding your niche. I don't know. So what we got podcasts, we've got trusted Sherpa that we could follow, and I think there are certain papers that we can start with, certain papers that allow us access to complex material, but the authors have intentionally written in an accessible way. For instance, when Dan Willingham writes, it's extremely accessible. When Paul Kirshner writes, it's extremely accessible. I mean, I think, the paper on why minimally guided instruction doesn't work, it's probably one of the best written papers I've ever read. Eat right from the off, establish what it is they're writing about, and then it's clear the whole way through. And that could be one of those watershed moments for people where people have talked about how it was their thunderbolt, where it sort of took the scales in their eyes. But it's a really good example of a paper that's really well written, and it needed to be really well written because it flew in the face of the prevailing narrative at the time, and probably the prevailing narrative now to some extent. And so that's what I would do. I mean, that's essentially what I did. Looked at what other people were doing, and then bit by bit, my outlook on teaching changed based on that reading. This stuff doesn't change overnight, doesn't happen overnight, but it gradually becomes a part of how you behave, as a person. So I think that would be my advice. I think expect it to happen over, but one of those thresholds where you go through and you can't remember when you didn't engage with this stuff. But at some point you have to start, and I think those are the three ways I would do it. I think on the thinkingdeeply.info website, I've got the references from Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics, certainly the references that are easily accessible online. If anyone's looking for accessible stuff on there, I would check that out, because it's got things like papers by Matthew Kraft, the one on teacher development, that kind of stuff. All papers that people can engage with in a meaningful way with little to no background knowledge, because I haven't got any papers on there that are dense to the point of impenetrability.
Yeah, I like the point about those Sherpas in particular. A couple of names that immediately jump to mind there. The likes of Sarah Cottingham on Twitter, Ephrat First. If you're interested in reading, Professor Timothy Shanahan, Pamela Snow. And in both of those cases, I think what's interesting there is, while those are both people with their names behind plenty of bona fide research, a great jumping off point into their work are the blogs that they write. So the Snow Report and Shanahan on literacy are, great places to begin. And the same with Sarah Cottingham, Ephrat First, I believe. I know Sarah blogs, I believe Ephrat First does as well. There are others that, of course, we can name, but don't be afraid to start with blogs and dare I say, books that are intentionally placed to summarize this stuff. So you mentioned Paul Kirshner. So I think is it Kirshner and Hendrick's book, How Learning Happens, is a nice place to start if you're looking for a jumping off point for, what papers might interest me. I mean, the nature of any collection of research papers is it's going to be somewhat related to the interests and biases of whoever is writing the book. That's inevitable. But as a jumping off point, it's absolutely, I loved it. It's absolutely terrific. I've not actually got around to buying and then reading the follow-up. I think is How Teaching Happens, like the red one. I need to, given how much I enjoyed How Learning Happens. But I think there are, if you ask around and say, look, I'm interested, you're on Twitter perhaps, and say, look, I'm interested in this subject and I want to just dive in, where do I begin? Usually you won't, it won't be too long before someone suggests something that is a gentle introduction to the key issues, in the way that something like Ending the Reading Wars is for reading research. So yeah, I think lots of good advice from you all around there, Kira.
I mean, there are two books that I read about the actual, not about the actual craft of engaging with research, but you've got Dan Williams' lesser spoken about book, which is When Can We Trust the Experts? And it's a lot like Ben Goldacre's Bad Science, and Tom Bennett has a book called Teacher Proof, where he goes through some of the fads that we've experienced and how they don't stack up against the evidence, things like brain gym, that kind of thing. So those two books, if we're looking at, how do we, and then even Bad Science itself is invaluable for teachers. I must have read that 3 or 4 times. Enjoyable read, but also in terms of changing your outlook on life, it was one of the books that, I was like, whoa.
Well, the one downside to Bad Science by Ben Goldacre is that it tempts you to read the follow-up with Bad Farmer, which is nowhere near as accessible or as enjoyable a read. I mean, still interesting stuff, but that is a real trudge in comparison. Sorry, Ben, if you're listening, which is almost certainly not the case. I guess one final thing to point out, and I know it can be a little controversial, is the value of organizations that do attempt to collate and communicate research, like the EEF. There are obviously going to be flaws that come about when you take complex areas of research and try to distill them in an accessible fashion. I mean, you and I, having attempted to do that in certain ways over the years and within this podcast, are aware, I think, of the pitfalls. But with that caveat aside, I do think a lot of the EEF guidance reports are a good place to start on things like literacy and in other areas. So yeah, consider them as a jumping off point. And once again, as I guess it's a bit of a theme, be prepared to deal with a little bit of uncertainty. Be prepared to treat anything you read or anything you hear with a sensible touch of skepticism, as makes sense when we're talking about engaging with empirical research.
Yeah, and I think that feeds back into what you're saying about methodology and methods in particular, and the kind of mathematics that can appear. I remember it must have been 2017, 2018 Research Ed National Conference. And we had a professor from University of Durham, which is obviously where Rob Coe works and teaches. And he was saying that he had some serious reservations about how effect sizes are measured. And these are obviously their colleagues, and they're talking about, they're having this argument or conversation every day. But effect sizes is something that lots of schools have bet the house on in terms of, the work of John Hattie and things like that there. But on some level, we have to accept that we do not have the time to become mathematical analysts, and we have to trust. Like you're talking about the EF. So if you go to the Education Endowment Foundation's website and the more you engage with that stuff, there's an equivalent in America, the What Works Clearinghouse. The more you engage with research, the more you read, the easier it is to smell a rat and think, hold on a second, I've read substantially about this in other places. This brief summary doesn't match up with my interpretation. But that only comes through, months and months and years of reading. But it does get easier, I think. So although we will never, in most instances, if not all, really have a grasp on the mathematics in many research studies, we can train ourselves to, like you said, spot patterns in the research. And when you find an outlier, it could be that there's an issue with the body of research in general, and this outlier is actually showing you something that might illuminate the truth, or as close to truth as we can get. Or it might be that there's something in the outlier that has prevented it from giving the similar result to comparable papers. I don't know. So yeah, don't stress about not understanding the maths or the numbers, and just practice makes more efficient detective work, I think.
Yeah, and along those lines, don't be afraid occasionally just to engage with the abstract, brief look at the methods, onto the discussion. If that's if it's a paper where you don't think you need to spend that much time on other bits and pieces, or equally, don't be afraid to, if you want to learn more about a subject, find a paper that is well written and look at the introduction to get an overview of that subject and say, you know what, I'm not actually interested in what this paper is talking about beyond that. The introduction, this well-written overview of where the rest of the field stands at this point is what I was after. You don't have to read research in the same way that you might read a novel where you're like, I need to engage with every sentence of this. It doesn't always have to be that way. I mean, generally, it's a good thing to do if it's a piece of evidence or a piece of research you're interested in, to read the whole thing. But you can dip into stuff. You can get a feel for certain ideas sometimes without having to read something completely comprehensively. All that said, it's been a pleasure to have the chance to ask you questions on this subject, Kieran, and to, I hope, build on what you had to say occasionally. So I'll hand back to you to, I'm not sure how to do that transfer.
No, I think you were fine up until the point where you said you didn't know how to do it. So I'll just cut that down.
Cut that out then. Yep, that's grand. If the bit before that vaguely made sense, then happy days.
No, it's been a lot of fun. Thursday night, end of the academic year. Would my answers be different or more eloquent at a different point? Perhaps. But hopefully, if any of our listeners are keen to get engaged or have colleagues who they would like to get engaged with research, then I think hopefully this will have been helpful. I mean, obviously, we go to quite a few research eds across the year. Sometimes they're quite a good way to dip your toe in the water, make some friends, and then see where it goes from there. I mean, at the very least, you'll be surrounded by like-minded people, and you won't you'll wear your nerd badge as a badge of honor. And I'm sure we'll come back to this again. I think this was a request on Discord from Tom Brassington, perhaps. So I hope this has met his brief. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks for having me on again.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.